Great. So hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar, getting started with Australia's sustainability reporting standards with the ASRS. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Arne Geschke, and I've got Louise Hall with me here in the call. We're gonna wait for another 30 seconds or so that everybody can join, and then we're gonna get started. We haven't even said anything yet, and there's already a raised hand. Catherine, how can we help? Ooh, hands back down. Okay.
Yeah, that's just a technical glitch at my end, sorry.
No worries. Okay, I'd say let's get started. So I'm going to start sharing and welcome again. Hope everyone can see my screen now. Yes, that looks good. So once again, welcome for our today's webinar, which is the first in a series of webinars around this topic, around the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, ASRS, with a specific focus for first-time reporting entities. And as you all know, the standard is being rolled out slowly through Tier 1 to Tier 3 companies. And we are right in the middle of this rollout period, you could say. And we really want to focus on those that are starting to report on emissions today, and also offer a few follow-up sessions further on where we go into a bit more nitty-gritty detail. So I'm joined by Louise Hall today, who's an expert in the ASRS. She will take us through the first half of the presentation. My name is Arne Geschke. I'm the Chief Data Officer and also co-founder here at Fair Supply. Louise is our Climate Solutions Executive and for climate reporting and emissions. But as I said, Louise is an absolute expert when it comes to the ASRS. And I'm really happy to have Louise on the call today to take us through the first bit. What we're going to cover today is a brief introduction, then the 4 pillars of ASRS, and then how we kind of link into that with additional resources. And of course, we have some time for you guys to ask a few questions towards the end. At Fair Supply, we have a bit of an odd mix of founding team. So I'm an industrial mathematician and recovering academic. My business partner, Kim, is a lawyer. And because my business partner is a lawyer, we have this disclaimer at the beginning of the presentation, which I assume you've all read. So we can jump straight in. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Louise. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session today. I guess, before we start, we are going to kind of keep this as a bit of an introductory session. There is so much detail to cover under these standards and the new legislation, and we realise that some of you might have seen some of this before, but hopefully there will be a lot to take away, even at the kind of slightly higher level today. And then, as Anna mentioned, we will be having a couple of follow-on sessions where we'll get into a little bit more detail in some of the areas of these reporting standards. And so I thought it would be helpful initially just to kind of take a bit of a bird's eye view, step back before we get too deep into the detail, and just kind of reminding us all about why we are here, why we have been tasked with this enormous job of climate reporting. And, I think there's no denying anymore that we are all feeling the impacts of climate change around the world, that is obviously something that we need to address. We need to try and do what we can to the mess that we've created as humans. And, you know, at the same time as climate change is going on, we've got global capital markets that are changing. Investors and regulators historically have maybe been primarily focused on financial performance of companies, and that is kind of changing. And there's a lot more focus as well these days on how resilient companies are going to be in a climate impacted future. And so, you know, all of these shifts happening at the same time has resulted in internationally, the International Sustainability Standards Board coming up with these climate related financial disclosure standards, and Australia's response is our newish ASRS framework, which includes the mandatory reporting standard of ASRS 2. So we can start getting into a bit more of the detail of that. And this is just a high-level overview explaining kind of how it all fits together. We have the Corporations Act, and there have been some amendments to that Corporations Act which create an obligation on certain corporations, businesses, and entities to now disclose climate-related financial disclosures in a sustainability report. And this is just a kind of an overview slide showing you the kind of last 2-ish odd years of how those amendments have been made in the legislation, both in the Corporations Act and then the accounting standards in ASRS 2 being issued, and also the assurance standards, which go hand in hand with those, and we'll talk to those shortly in a bit more detail. So the first group of entities that have been caught up in this have started their reporting already. For the Group 1 entities, which are the biggest entities, they will have started their first year as of financial period starting from 1 January 2025, so last year. And I'm sure you are all waiting with bated breath to see some of those first audited sustainability reports being published now for the 31 December 2025 year end, which will be coming soon. Next slide, please, Anna. So this just shows us a little bit about how all the pieces fit together. The Corporations Act has obviously had amendments, as I've mentioned, made to it, and the Corporations Act creates that obligation to publish a sustainability report. It gives us the who the reporting entities are, where the disclosures need to be made, and that is in a sustainability report that is included as part of your annual report alongside the financial statements as well. And then the Corporations Act also gives us a little bit of the what needs to go in there, and we'll get to that in a little bit more detail. And then the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards contain the standards and describe the what of those sustainability reports, what disclosures need to be made and how they need to be made. So the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards are largely based off the international standards set by the International Financial Reporting Standards, and they have been slightly adapted for the Australian legislation that has been in place prior to this. So you can see there the little green boxes. There's a Climate Change Act and also the NGER Act in Australia. And so the International Sustainability Reporting Standards have been adapted for those pieces of Australian legislation to ensure that there are no contradictions with that existing legislation. Could you click over? Thank you. So the Corporations Act requirements at a very kind of high level, you can see it requires a sustainability report to be to be compiled as part of an annual financial report. Those sustainability reports need to be accompanied by a director's declaration. And we'll touch on that again shortly. Some further requirements of that sustainability report is that it needs to be presented to an AGM if the reporting entity is required to hold an AGM. The report needs to be provided to the members of the company and the public. It needs to be lodged with ASIC, and ASIC is also the regulating body over those sustainability reports, as with financial reports. As with your financial records, those sustainability records also need to be kept for 7 years, and it is subject to the same liability framework under the Corps Act as your financial statements are, kind of around that misleading and deceptive conduct. So the director's declaration needs to be made with resolution, dated and signed, very much like financial reporting, and that sustainability report is also required to be audited. And so these are all of the kind of the high level requirements that are created by that Corps Act amendment. There are a couple of transitional provisions which give a little bit of relief in the kind of short term. And this is very much recognizing that this is a massive change for organizations, and it is going to take time to build capacity to be able to do this well. So the modified liability provisions are kind of temporary legal protections to give companies that little bit of breathing room while they are developing the experience and capability internally for their sustainability reporting. And so the protected statements in the sustainability reports are, some examples of them are forward-looking statements where climate-related statements are being made about the future. Those forward-looking statements are protected in the first year of this climate reporting regime. And then some of the others are around Scope 3, greenhouse gas emissions, scenario analysis, transition plans. Those areas of the disclosures are protected for 3 years, first 3 years of this new regime. And what that means in practice is that during this modified liability period, there can't be any private legal action brought against an individual or a company for misleading or deceptive conduct. However, ASIC is still able to take action where they deem it necessary, and as the regulator, they retain full enforcement power during that period. There's also another form of relief, is that the director's declarations are modified for the first 2 years from 1 January 25 until 31 December 26. So for those first 2 years of this climate reporting regime, in the director's declaration, they can declare that, in their opinion, the entity has taken reasonable steps to ensure compliance with the Corps Act and ASRS 2. And then once we move into year 3, they need to change that wording in the director's declaration that the sustainability report is actually in accordance with the Corps Act and ASRS 2. So that's obviously, far more definite wording. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the reporting groups for the stages and phases of when the entities need to start complying with this legislation. I suspect a lot of you have probably seen this, so I won't spend too long going over this, and we will also circulate the slides afterwards. But at a high level, there are 3 groups of entities. Group 1 is the largest entities, and then they kind of get smaller as we go down that table. The revenue, asset, and number of employee criteria, you need to meet 2 out of 3 of these criteria. So if you have a consolidated revenue of 500 million or more for the reporting entity and its group, and it has consolidated assets of 1 billion or more, then it is considered to be a Group 1 reporting entity and needs to comply with the timelines for those Group 1 entities in terms of reporting. And so we'll send this around and you can have a look and work out which of those entities, which of those groups your entity falls into, which will determine when you need to start reporting. You'll also notice that there is a delay in the Scope 3 reporting requirements. Initially, in terms of your emissions, you need to only report your Scope 1 and 2 emissions in your first year of reporting, and in acknowledgement that the Scope 3 emissions reporting is far more complex, there's been a delay in that, and you need to report Scope 3 only from your second year of reporting. Next, please, Anna. And so here is just a bit of a timeline graphic of the group companies. You can see the Group 1 climate reporting began 1 January 2025. For a lot of Australian entities who have a 30 June year end, those big Group 1 entities would have started their reporting on 1 July 2025 and submit them with their 2026, 30 June 2026 financial statements. And then you can see 12 months later, the Group 1 entities start reporting their Scope 3 emissions as well. And that's just kind of staggered then for Group 2 and Group 3. And so you can see here we are, January 2026. The next cohort is due to start reporting from 1 July this year. So I'm sure there are a number of you here who are in that next cohort. All right, next slide, please. So this is just a brief slide on the assurance standards. So assurance in sustainability reporting is an independent professional opinion about whether the information presented in those sustainability reports is accurate, reliable, and fairly presented. So very much like the assurance over financial statements. The level of assurance indicates how confident a practitioner or the auditor is that the information is free from material misstatement. So it probably all sounds very familiar. And limited assurance, you'll see that table has some areas where limited assurance is required for an interim period before reasonable assurance is required over all areas of that sustainability report. So that limited assurance is a moderate level of confidence that the auditor has over those disclosures. And the practitioner would conclude then that nothing has come to our attention to indicate a material misstatement. So it's kind of a lower level of confidence. The reasonable assurance, the wording around that would be, in our opinion, the information is fairly presented in all material respects. So you'll see again more relief around that, the auditing and assurance standards of that sustainability report in those first few years. The red blocks over here are kind of indicating where we currently are and which entities are affected. So you can have a look at that in a bit more detail too when the slides are sent around. All right, thanks, Anna. So the ASRS standards have got, so there are two standards that are included in that. There is AASB 1, which is kind of general disclosures. That one is currently a voluntary standard. And then AASB 2 is S2 is our mandatory standard that reporting entities need to comply with. Here you can see that the AASB S2 standard has got 4 key pillars. So we spoke about the standard being the what needs to be disclosed and the how it needs to be disclosed. And so the 4 key pillars are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And so we'll touch briefly on each of these pillars as we go through the webinar today. And you'll get a little bit more insight into what is required under each of those pillars as we progress. All right, should we kick off with governance on it? Thank you. So I'm sure it's also a term that most of you are familiar with. Governance is referring to kind of the structures, roles, and processes that an organization uses to direct, oversee, and be accountable for its decisions and performance. So what the governance disclosures are wanting to see is the how as well as the what. So we're wanting to see who is responsible for overseeing those climate-related issues. Are they individuals? Are they committees? Are they, groups? Who is it? And also how those bodies are monitoring, managing, and overseeing those climate-related risks and opportunities. And we've got a little example from an extract of a sustainability report, just to give you a sense of how that could be disclosed. One of the other things that they want you to disclose is what your processes are in terms of ensuring that you have actually got appropriate skills and competencies in your teams for these climate-related risks and opportunities. And so there would potentially be some, detail there on what you are doing as an organization to upskill and ensure that there are the sufficient competencies within your teams to manage these climate-related risks and opportunities. All right, we might move on to the next slide. So this is a little diagram that kind of gives you a bit of a sense of effective governance structures. This will look very different for organizations of different sizes, but you can kind of see you might have a board of directors that sits at the top, board committees, executive groups, group committees, and then kind of it filters down through the organization at various levels. And so it's important for you to be able to define the roles of each of these governance kind of bodies through the organization, and disclose that in your sustainability report. It's also wanting you to disclose, to establish clear mandates that integrate those climate risks and opportunities into your broader governance structures. And so the most effective way that we see organizations doing this is not to create siloed, separate climate and sustainability structures, but actually to integrate them into existing governance structures within the organization. Anna, do you want to move on? And so here is a bit of an example from the Woolworths sustainability report, where you can see they talk about the Woolworths Group Board, what they're responsible for, the Sustainability Committee, Audit and Finance Committee, and Risk Committee that sit underneath that, and what each of those committees are responsible for. That feeds down into the next level of governance and what each of those committees are responsible for. And so again, we'll send this around. It's just a good example to see in practice what all those disclosure requirements might look like. Thanks, Anna. All right, so the next pillar that the standard talks to is the strategy pillar. Now, what's in practice, you would go through the process of identifying your climate-related risks and opportunities first, and then you would come and have a look at your strategy and see how that strategy, the strategy is kind of managing those risks and opportunities. So I'm going to hand over to Anna shortly to have a talk about those risks and opportunities, but we thought we'd stick in the order that the standard addresses those pillars. And so we'll have a quick chat about what is required under the strategy pillar for managing those climate-related risks and opportunities first. So, sorry, could you just tuck back to the previous slide? Thank you. So the reporting standards require reporting entities to explain what plans they have previously disclosed to address their climate-related risks and opportunities. And then they need to describe how they're progressing against that using both qualitative and quantitative information. And so the qualitative information would be kind of explanations around what happened, why, what's changed, what's not working, what is working, and then the quantitative metrics around those disclosures might be more numbers, dollar values, targets, milestones, financial impacts of the plans that they have disclosed. And so an example might be for a property company where the plan that they have previously disclosed about their physical climate risk and asset resilience might be that the group committed committed to climate proofing 100% of their coastal and flood exposed assets by 2027 through capital upgrades, insurance program optimization, and revised building standards. Now, the qualitative progress disclosure the following year could be something like the risk assessments completed in 2025 identified 3 major retail assets in North Queensland faced materially higher cyclone exposure than previously modelled. As a result, the group reprioritised its capital allocation to accelerate roof reinforcement and drainage upgrades at these sites. So you can see how they're going back to what was previously disclosed, they're commenting on that, what's shifted, what's changed, and what have we done as a result. And they go on to say insurance premiums for upgraded properties declined by an average of 9%, reflecting improved risk ratings from insurers. And so you can see there they are describing those qualitative, the qualitative progress against that disclosure. And then quantitative disclosure might look like the assets, giving the percentage of assets that have been assessed for their physical climate risk, the percentage of their assets that have been upgraded under their upgrade plan, the dollar value of climate resilience capex that has been spent. And so it's putting more kind of measurable quantitative figures around those disclosures. So the strategy needs to address the effects on the entity's business model and value chain. And this is where it's really important for a company to really have a good understanding of their value chain. And this is something that, you know, we do at Fair Supply day in and day out, is having a look at supply chains and value chains and where they lie in the world, and the geography of those becomes quite important when you are looking at the impacts of climate on your value chains. The effects on the entity's strategy and decision making, and then also on the entity's financial position, performance, cash flows, and they need to report on that in the short, medium, and long term. And so the inputs that go into understanding those effects on the company's strategy is scenario analysis and climate-related transition planning. And so those are 2 tools effectively that companies can use to assess that resilience and strategy that they have in place for climate. All right. So if we have a look at scenario analysis, we ultimately are looking at how resilient, we're wanting to get a better understanding of how resilient a company is, an organization might be, to perform under different hypothetical future climate states. And so what's required under our legislation is that companies need to have a look at least 2 scenarios. They need to have a look at a minimum increase of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and then also in excess of 2 degrees. And what is what is interesting is that the actual accounting standard doesn't specify these two scenarios, but the Corps Act does. And so companies need to use at least these two scenarios. Well in excess of 2 degrees Celsius is kind of generally accepted to be 2.5 degrees Celsius. It is an interpretation, but companies can use those two and also additional scenarios in the scenario analysis that might be relevant to their organizations and their businesses. And so it's important to note that the scenario analysis is kind of hypothetical. It's not a forecast of what is going to happen, but it is really helpful to challenge the conventional thinking about the future. It's helpful for teams to get together and brainstorm what impacts their business might have if there were to be an increase in global temperatures, understanding those value chains, what impacts that change in temperature might have on the assets of the business, and elevate yourself outside of the now and your existing strategy and have a look at how you might have to be agile to adapt in the future. So here are a couple of kind of suggested steps, simplified slightly, just to have a look at how you might go about the scenario analysis when you are taking it on internally. The most effective way to carry out this scenario analysis is by having a range of stakeholders in the business involved. So the first step would be to say, who are the key stakeholders in our business who we feel need to be involved in this process, and get a bit of a task force together of those key stakeholders. The next step would be defining the scope of the analysis. Have a look at which business units are going to be included, which assets, which locations those assets might be in, or your operations might be in, what time horizon you're performing this scenario analysis over, and how many scenarios you are wanting to include. So as mentioned, the legislation requires you to use the two scenarios of 1.5 and well in excess of 2 degrees increase in global temperatures, but you might decide that you want to model another 1 or 2 or however many, because they are also relevant to your business and your operations. And then you run your scenarios and identify potential outcomes from those scenarios. And so this would potentially look a little bit like kind of working group brainstorming different scenarios, the impacts on your value chains. This could be very dependent on where your operations sit, where you might have manufacturing plants around the globe, how dependent you are on agriculture. And so the scenarios that you are brainstorming and modeling here, you really want to make relevant to your operations and your organization. And then, kind of at the end, you want to see, well, what are these impacts that could play out on our business? What are the risks around these scenarios that we have modeled? And have a look at how you might need to adjust your business strategies to accommodate potential impacts. So one thing to note is that ASBS2 wants you to use a scenario analysis that is, the wording they use is commensurate with the entity's circumstances. So not to go and map out flood risk if that's not terribly relevant to your organization. So, Woolworths, for example, might use drought modeling in their scenario analysis and look at what drought impacts there may be at different temperatures. And that would make sense for their business because they are really dependent on agriculture. Whereas maybe a medical device company, drought modeling wouldn't be as relevant for them. But if they have got manufacturing plants in kind of low-lying coastal areas, then flood modeling might be really relevant for them. And so they would have a look at flood modeling instead of the drought modeling. So, that's what the standard is meaning, is they want you to focus on scenarios that are relevant to your business operations and value chains. All right, and then the other piece that the other tool to use around the strategy disclosures is your climate-related transition plan. So for companies to really have a look at the transition plans of the entity is moving towards a lower carbon economy. What are your plans to shift towards that lower carbon economy? It requires you to include your emissions and your targets for reducing those greenhouse gas emissions, and what resources you're going to allocate to this transition plan, and also then set a time frame around when you are undertaking to achieve the targets in this transition plan, and how the targets will be delivered. So again, lots of the how that it's wanting to see disclosed here, how you're actually going to achieve those targets that you have set as part of your transition plan. I might wrap up the strategy piece there, and Anna is going to talk a little bit more about the risk management, and we'll touch on those transition risks a little bit more. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks a lot, Louise. So now we're getting to the point where things are not going well anymore, where we actually have to manage the risk that we might be presented with. So there's of course a paperwork component to it. But I always try to focus on what are we actually trying to achieve here. This is ASRS, and AASBS2 is obviously a reporting framework, but it's not just the box ticking exercise. It's something that should actually get us underway to really identifying what could go south in our future as businesses, and identifying and risking those kinds of risks together with the strategy piece that Louise just covered is hugely important to be economically viable going forward in this environment that is changing around us. So we need to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. There are two main risk categories, you could say. One is the physical risks, that is literally when the cyclone takes the roof off the factory hall. And then there's the transition risks. As the world transitions, we don't want to be left behind. We want to identify opportunities that are presented to us through these transitions, those kinds of things. Then the scenario analysis is very similar to what Louise already covered. What does that look like if these physical risks really come our way? And then how do we integrate that with the broader risk management? And then, of course, mitigate the risk, find strategies to mitigate these risks. And this is already real today. So we already have increased risks. If you're based in Sydney, like Louise and I are, you've probably seen that the Hawkesbury River had a series of floods in the last few years. I think the term once in 100-year flood was used 3 times in the last 10 years. So there's like a considerable exposure when you're living in the Hawkesbury Valley now to floods that are moving into a frequency that is unprecedented and will cause financial loss, because if downstairs gets flooded up to 2 meters high every 5 or 6 years, that is something that would make people reconsider whether they still want to live there or not. And similar effects are starting to happen with our extensive bushfires we had a few years ago. The drought that preceded those bushfires had huge impacts on livestock rearing further west in New South Wales. Those kind of risks are starting to become real and material. So then on the other side, we have, so those are mainly the physical risks. So the acute risks are bushfire, extreme weather, and flooding. And then we have the chronic risk, which is rising sea levels. If you've been to the Sydney beaches in the last few weeks, you probably will have seen that they're all a lot smaller than what they used to be. There's a lot of erosion going on at the moment with the bad weather. Then we have increased temperatures and, of course, water scarcity has always been a topic in Australia. It's becoming a big problem as we move forward. But on the other side, there's the transition risks. Policies are changing. So policies such as the one that we are talking about now. AASBS2 is by itself not a transition risk, but it becomes a risk if maybe the board is not so interested in actually fulfilling its obligations. So those kinds of policies around the world are changing the way we are linked to those kinds of transitional movements and risks. If those regulations are not followed, litigation can follow, markets can shift, and reputation. And this is not just a problem, or this is not just a situation that is limited to climate change related regulations and policies. If you follow the news, and we all do, we know that reputations and markets are changing and shifting very quickly, almost on a daily basis. So those kinds of things are also climate related. We need to deal with that. So, and then there's something that people often don't actually really realize is with risks also come opportunities. And I think this is a hugely undervalued side of climate change, is that if you play your cards right and you play them early, there's actually a huge business opportunity that is at the same time much more in line with a pro-climate action than what has mainstreamed as an opinion around the world. So, and lots of those things are actually directly, being green is actually directly linked to being much more efficient when it comes to spending, essentially. I gave a keynote a few weeks ago in Brisbane, and I wanted to talk about renewable energy and solar in particular in Queensland. And I asked into the audience, who's got solar panels on their roof at home? And it was probably, out of the 40 people there, 36 has solar panels on their roof. So that is, if you keep the solar panels on for long enough and they've paid back their own impact from when they were produced, that is a positive climate move, and it also saves money. There's a lot of those symbiotic relationships between going green and going more efficient that we're not exploiting yet. So, and we've got a few listed here: so transport, waste, building, water, products and services as well. I think markets and resilience, that's a completely untapped opportunity that we haven't really realized yet. And that's, for example, when you think about carbon border adjustments mechanisms, such as in the European Union, if you are good at reporting on your emissions, then you've done your homework and you can move past those adjustments mechanisms faster than your competitors. You might, if you are really ahead in terms of global carbon reporting, you might be able to outrun competitors as they change markets. For example, in North America, if you followed the speech of the Canadian Prime Minister, Canada is actively trying to adjust its trade relationships away from a US-focused trade structure, more to a diversified trade structure. And in that process, Canadian companies will have to deal with European climate regulations in a way that they haven't before. And those companies that get ahead of that, that get their head around these kind of regulations and disclosure obligations quickly, they will probably have a head start against their competitors. And the same happens all around the world at the moment. And there's some areas where there's more focus, like the EU, but there's also movement in Southeast Asia. We've got ties, and we work with big companies in Southeast Asia as well, where maybe the obligations are not quite as strong yet as they are in other parts of the world, but still there's movement happening. And that, of course, then translates to resilience. So we can then either ourselves become more resilient, or with a better climate process internally, supply chain process, we are able to spot risks in our supply chains, whether they're climate related or broader, much earlier, and we can build up a resilience in-house for our own business. So these are just a few examples here, and I don't want to run out of time, but this is just a few examples here of how these risks can be assessed. Things like there's flood maps available that show the change in the Australian coastline under different climate scenarios, and they show quite brutally where things will flood. And often in coastal areas, for example, if you look at the flood maps for Brisbane Airport between now and 2100, it's not a good news story. And those kinds of tools are available. and we can assess these intersection and we can assess those impacts. We still have the time window to assess and evaluate the options we have to build up resilience against those scenarios, and then make that move. But that needs to this time window will be closing very fast at some stage. We're still a bit away from it at the moment, but especially for flooding, but for things like bushfires or sort of localized flooding that comes from heavy rainfall and not from change of sea level, those kinds of effects are already being felt now. And then we have, of course, like a very complex indirect set on the right-hand side here. Our own company might be safe. Our facilities might be safe from the most obvious risks. Of course, you never know which path a cyclone exactly is going to take, but maybe your company doesn't have facilities in areas that are prone to flooding caused by sea level rise. But there might be suppliers that are. There might be tier 2, tier 3 suppliers that are subject to those kinds of problems. And so we have to build up this muscle, this procedural muscle internally to understand how can we really screen our supply chains? How can we screen for climate-related risks, and how can we define a threshold where it's just too much and we don't want to go any further? Targets and metrics. So this is where I am at home. Targets and metrics by themselves can sometimes seem like an annoying box-ticking exercise. Why should I spend all that time going through my suppliers and assess their emissions so that I can compile my Scope 3 exposure for my reporting? But without these targets and metrics, we can't really start. They hold a substantial role in the entire process that the ASRS2 is aiming at. So the standard, the usual suspects on the left-hand side, of course, greenhouse gas emissions during the reporting period are the obvious ones. There's lots of talk around how do I assess my Scope 3. Louise also mentioned in the beginning that Scope 3 has a bit of a delay around AASBS2. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are probably a lot more better understood, and we are more comfortable with those emission types. But nevertheless, until we understand where our exposure is for climate, we can't actually really work with it. So the metrics and targets are a very important component of that. The financial impact, the internal carbon price, and then, of course, how the climate-related factors go into the executive remuneration. So is the board doing a good job at protecting the company from future climate disasters? And then the targets on the right-hand side, they can be qualitative and quantitative. And there's none of these two options is better than the other. They both have their role. There's an objective for each of the targets. Then how do we measure the target? When we want to get there? So do we want to move our facilities between now and 2028, or do we give ourselves time between now and 2020, 35 or 40? Do we want to reach net zero, and what time frame do we want to reach net zero? Those kinds of things. And then how carbon credits are included, and how it fits into international agreements and everything. And we are obviously living in a time of change, but just because maybe some countries are turning their back on these kinds of ideas certainly doesn't mean that those problems are going to go away. And so the aim of AASBS2 is almost independent of political couleur or attitude, you could say. The problems will stick around, and we need to deal with those whether we want to or not. So for any one of you on the call who has worked with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you have probably seen this picture more than enough. We want to cover it anyway, just briefly. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol split emissions into 3 different scopes. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are the ones that are quite easy to understand from an intuitive standpoint. Scope 3 are the indirect ones, the value chain emissions. You can see there's a lot more symbols in those gray Scope 3 boxes or buildings, whatever you want to call them, than in Scope 1 and Scope 2. So there's a lot more work to do for Scope 3 than for Scope 1 and Scope 2. And the approach is completely different. And we're going to have a separate session just on that. We don't want to cover this too much now. But a full emissions assessment encompasses all 3 of these. And then if you want to dive into Scope 3, I'm not going to go into detail with this one, we're running out of time, is that within the Scope 3 category, which is a bit like, It's almost a bit like the reject category. If you look at this one here, the reporting company scope 1 is pretty obvious. It's your company facilities and your company vehicles. And then scope 2 is your purchased energy and purchased heating and cooling. Still makes sense. We understand how the energy grid operates. Scope 3 has everything in it that is not captured by scope 1 and scope 2, and that's a lot. And so within scope 3, there's a further subcategorization into upstream, downstream, and then even further into categories within upstream and downstream. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol wants you to report on all of these. And when you see this for the first time, you might go, oh dear, I think maybe my next 25 weekends are done. And of course, we don't want that. We don't want to spend our time reporting so we have no time to actually make a change. We want to really find efficient ways to get to this information so we can use it effectively and meaningfully to move forward. And so there's a whole heap of, in my opinion, misconception what this framework is meant to provide. And we're going to focus on that in the future sessions. This is a sneak preview where we want to dive into this. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, although this is literally my life, is to look after the engine and the data sets that sit underneath our scope 1, 2, and 3 calculation solution. But as maybe a takeaway is that often emissions reporting still has a very consulting type flavor to it. And somebody said in a call just a few days ago, consulting is always expensive, and I don't always have the budget. And I think that's exactly the angle that we are taking at Fair Supply, is that we want to move away from this consultative approach to emissions reporting and embed this much, much deeper into large data models that do much of the heavy lifting for our customers. And now that we've arrived in an age of AI, even the interpretation of the results can be assisted hugely through AI. And so there's a whole opportunity here to first of all make this more cost effective compared to consulting, but also secondly make this faster, make the entire carbon management process much more meaningful than what it has been in the past, so that you can move towards a what to do now, what to do next, how can I define my strategies much quicker rather than spending months and months on the metrics and targets reporting side of things. But as I said, we're going to cover this in more detail in the coming weeks. We've got an additional sources slide here. We are currently offering an ASRS email mini course where we take you step by step through the 5 steps of how to, or a number of steps of how to get started if you haven't done it before, and kind of reduce and remove the noise around these what can seem quite clunky legislations from the start, and really cut through the chase and get to, okay, this is step 1, this is step 2, this is not going to take you a whole year. This is how we can get you to that point where you're ready for reporting, and also where you're ready to make meaningful decisions within the company. I think that's it, right? So yeah, we've got 2 more webinars coming up in the next 2 weeks. I'm going to be in both of them, and I'm going to be joined by my colleague Liam Brizzi, who's working in our customer success team and has, you could say, frontline experience from carbon reporting of several years now, and always has a great anecdote how things can be made easier and more efficient. That's it. I think it's 1:24, and we have a little bit of time for questions, but I haven't been able to look at the questions yet. Let me just check. Yes. I might just move back to camera mode. And we already have a raised hand here from Mark. Mark, please fire away.
Mark.
I'll just go through the questions then.
Not sure if it is a hand raise. It would also be really helpful for us to hear from you if there are any areas that you would like. Sorry, I just had a bit of a cough. If there are any areas that you feel you would like a deeper dive on, because we're very happy to take feedback and try and plan some sessions that you feel would be helpful to dive deeper on. So feel free to reach out and let us know what would be helpful.
Okay, I've got a few questions. Should we go through them bit by bit? The first one's very specialized from Catherine. I'm not sure, Louise, if we can cover that.
I've said to her, I'll have a chat to her offline on that one.
Great. Okay, what else do we have?
Rachel Hart.
No, I guess.
Yeah, Rachel, industry focused sessions. Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful to know that would
Yep.
be beneficial to you. We can definitely have a look at running a few of those for sure.
Yeah, there's a few verticals where I think there's lots of concentrated interest. So we see that in healthcare and other service industries as well, but also energy and mining resources is always an interesting one. The interesting one with healthcare is that it's a almost a mix between a service business and not, I wouldn't say manufacturing, but like especially hospitals have very, very complex supply chains, whether it's like the machinery, the even like the huge capex that goes into hospitals. Then, of course, you have cleaning services, which often have like a slightly higher exposure to forced labor environments, but also highly complex supply chains. Obviously, when you look at all the resources that go into our modern healthcare, so this is a really interesting vertical, and I think it'd be really exciting to do a session on that, Rachel. So thanks for suggesting that. I think that's it, right? I think we have no further questions at this point. Thanks for sticking around, everyone. And we're really looking forward to the next two webinars. Big thank you to Louise for joining me today. And I wish you all like a lovely afternoon. I'll see you next week. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.